Welcome to the Organic Filaments Network. I'm Sher Ali Khan. With me here is Julie Reshe, who is a philosopher and psychoanalyst, who has written one of the most quietly radical books in recent years, Negative Psychoanalysis for the Living Dead, which was published in 2023 by Palgrave. Her work turns away from the language of self-improvement and well-being to think about life as something inseparable from decay. She calls this negative practice not a therapy, but a way of staying close to what is broken without turning it into a project of repair. Our conversation, our conversation turns around that question, what it means to live, love, think when the possibility of cure has already collapsed. Welcome to the show, Julie. How are you doing?
Thank you, Cher.
Excellent. Negative psychoanalysis begins from what cannot be restored, from the fractures that remain. It doesn't aim to make life better, but to stay with what persists in its broken form. How does this orientation reshape the meaning of vitality when life is understood through its own undoing?
From what I heard, so negative psychoanalysis and in general, negative practice that I'm trying to develop, it deals with negative underside of existence, the negative underside of life. And while in general, all the social practices and including psychoanalysis to a certain extent, or at least all the therapeutic practices, they deal with they're positively oriented, so to say. So they aimed at improving life or aimed at cure. In short, they are aimed at salvation, certain form of salvation, at improvement. So they have positive direction. And what I represent with this negative practice and negative kind of psychoanalysis is the negative underside of existence. And it's not that much that this is kind of a competing approach in relation to other therapeutic practices. It's not that I'm trying to impose, for me, it's better, I like it more. But it's not that I'm trying to competing with other practices that are positively oriented or trying to preserve, improve life or life oriented. It's just that this thing that I represent, it's talking about something else, or it's paying attention to something else that it's forgotten by positive orientation, that positive orientation itself is not capable to notice, and I feel responsible for representing it, not forgetting it. And from a position of we could talk about negative psychoanalysis, but we can equally talk about negative existentialism or negative philosophy, because in all the theories, in all the ways we talk about existence, you have the negative is mentioned. And in some of the currencies or in some of the currents of philosophical thought, for example, it's also emphasized as the crucial, as central or structural. And this is my sphere where I am um, existing or persisting. Like in negative psychoanalysis, it's also seen normally as a therapeutic practice or clinical practice aimed at cure to a certain extent, maybe to modest extent, but it's seen as a therapy, as improvement. But there are certain concepts in psychoanalysis that I love that are talking about death and suffering as structural or something we cannot run away from. And those are my favorite concepts in psychoanalysis, like the death drive. In existentialism, we also have this emphasis on the negative underside of existence, which, for example, in Heidegger, it's anxiety. Anxiety that is existential grounding mood, and you cannot escape from it. You can only try to modify it. And well, in other philosophies, we also sometimes have it. So I gather bits, scraps of negativity to kind of form um, more substantial project, both theoretical and practical.
Your book suggests that being alive is not opposed to dying, but animated by it. That decay is a rhythm of life itself. What kind of freedom or clarity emerges from that sort of recognition?
So this is negative perspective, right? And negative perspective also in psychology in particular, it's close to the perspective of depressive realism. Depressive realism, which suggests that depression, it's not inadequate state, or not the state when we are inadequate in our comprehension of reality, but on the contrary, something that makes us more adequate. And negative psychoanalysis, or this negative practice or project that I have, to a certain extent would agree with this perspective, at least because it's not stigmatizes depression. I don't think that it gives you clear perception of like scientific, more scientifically better perspective of reality, but at least it's the perspective that tries not to stigmatize depression, and therefore not to unsee it, not to discredit it. And this is what I'm interested in, with is guarding certain negative states. And from this perspective, the depressive realism perspective or negative perspective, there is no life actually. What we call life is just dying. So you can say both that I'm alive, but you can also describe your existence as you are dying. So in positive, normal, common sense perspective, there is life, which is aimed at salvation. There is life, and we pretend that we can make life eternal. We can extend it, we can improve it, this existence, the positivity, all the good things, which is the project of salvation, which motivates us and keeps us going and brings us together. And from this depressogenic perspective or depressive realism perspective, there is no life, it's just illusion, the better way to call it. What exists is the universal death, destruction of universe, of ourself, of society, and life is just the tour, or the process of dying, how death is unfolding in existence, and there is no salvation that is awaits for us or what we are approaching, but rather something opposite. And also to clarify, it's not the perspective that I'm trying to impose and claim that this is better. For me, it is better than other positive perspective, because I'm not inadequate to that extent. I do understand that the need of positivity, how it's important for society, how one cannot structure society and cannot persist that much only on based on a negative perspective. We psychologically, existentially need positive stuff. This is just more for those who don't fit in a generally positive perspective. And it's not that I'm trying to impose certain teaching on it, because the idea of on society, because the idea of teaching is also salvational. Like, look at me, I have better perspective, and I will tell you, I will lead you somewhere to a better place. This is not it, because this is not the negative process. It's rather gathering people who already know, who cannot have troubles fitting into the positively oriented therapeutic society, who don't lost maybe their ability or never had one to trust it, who see it as suspicious, like traumatized people, for example, who, or depressed people, but depressed people who lost the hope to certain at least extent to be fixed. So those people who already know that, who don't need to be, who know that exist, not theoretically but existentially, and to a certain extent I think it's all of us. So it's not the teaching and the certain theory that is better than other that I'm representing. It's rather the instance of failure of teaching and leading and salvation that I'm representing, like a place for those who don't fit, the misfits that uh, I uh, organize, the hostess of the place where misfits can gather.
That's very interesting, and thank you for that. The figure of the living dead describes a form of endurance without transcendence, life. How does that condition speak to the contemporary existence where survival itself often replaces living?
Survival is kind of overly positive term. We think about survival, well, you can think about it negatively, as when we survive, it's opposite to life. Then we just bear existence. But it's still, at the same time, the idea of survival, it's too positive. And I don't think that in this positive characteristic, survival, it is something that describes what we are doing. Because this normal common sense and scientifically, something that is presented as scientifically neutral perspective, that human being is aimed, and all the species are aimed at survival, that this is what we are inclined to preserve life and to all the positive things to enjoy, uh, and this is the perspective that we currently have as a common sense perspective to see ourselves through it. And I don't, from the perspective that I represent, I don't agree with it. I don't think that this is what is going on. Again, if you see human being from a negative perspective, like not the one who is alive and aimed at survival, but the one who is tragically dying, tragically disappearing and suffering. And this is what is happening. It's not that survival is happening and overcoming suffering. It's the suffering that is happening and our miserable failed attempts to overcome suffering every time. So all of our attempts to survive and to overcome suffering end up into just another way of unfoldment of suffering. This is the negative perspective. And this one I would agree with. So for me, human being and other species and everything, the universe as such is the tragic creature or tragic way of tragic being. What is happening is just us creatively suffering, enduring the death that is going on in life, because from common sense perspective, again, it's life. Death is something opposite to life. It comes at the end of life to cancel life, or maybe as a from certain religious perspective as a transition to eternal life. For me, or from existential perspective, death is what operates in life. So it's not opposite, it's the structural underside of what we call life. Life is rather death's unfoldment and all the things that come with it, like the suffering.
In what sense is the living dead not a metaphor of modern condition of subjectivity?
So for me, I don't think the figure of a living dead, or at least I'm not using it, I'm trying not to use it as a metaphor. And I'm not trying to use it also, or not only to reduce it to a critique of modern society. I'm trying to see it as not metaphoric and universal, which comes together with seeing death as not metaphoric but universal. Because when we talk about the living dead, or the death as a concept in philosophy, the problem is that they try to make it too abstract or to theorize it, to develop various types of theories, philosophical comprehension of it, like in existentialism with the concept of being towards death, and in psychoanalysis with the concept of death drive. They're talking about death, and we can say, and figures of living dead, even though it's not existential and not a psychoanalytic concept. But nonetheless, there is a risk here of reducing it to metaphor, and through this operation to not to see it as a real thing that is going on. That's in general problem with philosophy. It sometimes talks about things in order to mask them or not to talk about them. So Heidegger is the one who introduces concept of death, the one who in philosophy, the one who comprehends it as one of those who comprehends it as crucial for existence, as unfoldment into existence, something that structures existence. But by this very operation, he is not able to see actual death. He at the same time introduces it, but through this very movement escapes from seeing real death. Something similar with death drive and with all the trauma concept in psychoanalysis. It kind of talks about it, theorizes it. Even it's based to a certain extent with work with real people, real trauma survivors. But at the same time, it theorizes it, makes it part of a psychoanalytic theory, and doesn't actually see real destructive processes that are going on with political, with critical psychoanalysis and critical philosophical perspective. When we talk about living death as current people who are suffering, it's also at the same time way of recognizing it, that there is the real suffering people that are existing and there are real political causes for it. So at the same time, it's important movement of recognizing suffering, something that I think is really important, but at the same time it's the way of reducing or not way of not seeing suffering, because you implied that it's not universal, that it's reducible to certain political causes, and it's again salvational narrative, which I think is supposed to exist. It's very important, but what I represent is different. It's rather resisting concretization, resisting this salvational narrative that pretends to see sometimes, but doesn't really see it. And maybe it's impossible to completely recognize it. And the language as such might function. Even talking about the importance of seeing it might be a way of not seeing it. So it's problematic space that I'm occupying. The concept of a living dead is articulated not for the first time, but in this context by Catherine Malabou, who is talking about it as a critique of Freudian too abstract account of trauma, too abstract account of this negative underside of existence, because Freudian account is aimed at healing. And when something is aimed at healing, it cannot recognize some tragic lives, a tragic existence that cannot be fixed. It's only aimed at fixation, at cure. It doesn't fit, this kind of language doesn't fit to talk about those who cannot, or this register of existence, or certain instances of human existence that cannot be fixed. It's language that is not appropriate for talking about it and recognizing it. And she introduces concept of destructive plasticity and the living dead to talk about those people, to talk about them outside of the narrative of salvation. But with her concept, it's also problematic to a certain extent, because sometimes she and others who use her concept, they use it, the concept of a living dead, as a political critique, meaning it's still salvational, it's still with the aim to fix something. And I would insist on at least adding the universal account. Well, for me, you have to, I still agree that you need to aim to reduce suffering, but you also necessarily fail. If you don't fail, you're not engaging with it. And any cure, it's never a cure. We still believe within the positive narrative, which is the common sense narrative, we still think that cure is important and use this concept. It's the concept that comes from medical discourse or a religious discourse of salvation. We believe that there is instance where something is cured, but from negative perspective, when there is no life and there is no cure, what exists is just you might postpone or modify suffering, but you can never cure it. There is certain layer of existence where nothing is cured. And what we represent as cure or salvation or improvement is just the detour. It's the more illusionary, not substantial stuff that is going on.
How does the denial of death give rise to the social political compulsion toward purity, productivity, and immorality?
At least from a psychoanalytic perspective, where what actually going on that emphasizes the centrality of a death drive or centrality of negativity in form of lack and loss. What is actually happening, what is actual structural structural element for both self, the subject, and the social bond is loss, is something negative. And touching this core, it gives suffering. But society is structured in such a way that it's positively oriented and it aimed not to notice this core. It aims to cover it with the fantasy of certain forms of salvation, or certain forms of improvement, or certain forms of seeing existence through the positive lens, that one can get rid of this structural suffering or structural lack. All the social ideologies, including capitalism, can be seen as a way of the fantasy, the attempt to cover the structural suffering, the structural, like the way of covering it and escaping from it. But it necessarily fails because it's structural. So this is another creative form of escaping the structural basis of lack, or the structural basis of suffering.
What is the logic of a love that does not heal but exposes two beings to each other's deadness? And what kind of relation becomes possible within that exposure? This is from chapter 4.
So love is very important topic for me, and I consider it as very negative topic, and unlike it's normally seen as a positive thing and something that is associated with life. One of the one of the biggest problems for me in psychoanalysis, in philosophy, is that love is not given enough negative attention. At least the problem in psychoanalysis, one of the most crucial problems is, for me, is absence of love. and an absence of death. Those two problems of not seeing death and not seeing love, for me, they are connected. So for Freud, with his initial comprehension of human being, which is for us still common sense, is that human being is egoistic. A human being is aimed at survival and aimed at pleasure. And this is what we are at our core, this life-oriented, positive, egoistic project. I don't think this is adequate, good perspective to comprehend what is human being. And for this reason, because Freud see human subject as this kind of positive subject, he is not able to theorize, to talk about love, because love, his eros, it doesn't fit here. When love comes, or eros is comprehended through this lens as aimed something that is still egoistic, as our desire to satisfy certain needs, to attain pleasure, and it's still not love. It's our own egoistic need. It's not love. Love implies two people at least, or more. It implies it's opposite to egoistic inclination. And the person that helps a lot here is Sabina Spielrein, um, with her account of death drive that precedes Freudian, and she's able to to theorize love through connecting it to death drive, because for Freud, both love, eros, and death drive are part of is about the subject, about egoistically driven subject. And for Sabina Spielrein, I think maybe because her account is more not feminist but feminine, she's able to see love itself not as the egoistic as something kind of modification, Freudian modification, but love as something that connects, as a connection between subject, and at the same time she places death drive, um, connects it with connects love with death drive, and death drive for her exists not within the subject but in between subjects. And her subject, the initial subject of Sabina Spielrein, for me it's the negative subject. It's not egoistic one, how we normally think about people, that we are at our core egoistic and we need to work on ourselves to be better. But still, this kind of work fails because we improve ourselves through love or through something, and still us that are improved. It still ends up being, every altruism from this perspective ends up being egoistic. And I disagree with, for me, it's very inadequate comprehension of human being. I think that more genuine comprehension of human being is that we are structurally, there is love more, this in-betweenness, than the egoistic substance. I don't think that there is any egoism in us. I think it's rather about love and self, something that we love or someone that we love, and this self-destruction that is happening inside through us dedicating ourselves to other or to something that we love. This is what is death drive for Sabina Spielrein. So it's different logic of comprehension of subject and comprehension of love. It's not that it's a type of love, that it's sacrificial. It's the love itself is rather what Sabina Spielrein, with her account of love and death drive, is able to comprehend, and Freud is not able to comprehend. For Freud, there is no love. What he call, or what we can call love from psychoanalytic perspective, is this extension of egoistic drive. It's not love, it's egoistic drive, it's opposite to love. And if you start with love and see that it's not the egoistic subject that is existing, but love that exists, and love as a destructive power, love as rather suffering, and we as subject is something secondary or more illusionary to this destructive power of love, and we get involved into this love. This is the perspective that Sabina Spielrein represents, and this is the perspective that is actually able to comprehend love, and the perspective I actually prefer for this reason.
The book draws from Malabou's idea of destructive plasticity, where destruction isn't an end but another mode of transformation. How does this change the way we understand creation when collapse itself becomes a part of how forms live and change?
So for both Catherine Malabou and Sabina Spielrein, what is important for me, what they represent, is that destruction is not separate from creation. From account of Catherine Malabou, what is important for her is to show that destruction itself is creative. And this is something huge, because we normally think of creation as opposite of destruction, and we see destruction as the obstacle to creation. So we never, because of that, Catherine Malabou claims that, and she's right, that we are never able to see destruction as creative, destruction as forming its own figures, as formative. And in clinical discourse, in scientific discourse, we always tend to see any destructive processes as just the opposite of creation, and we're not able to theorize them. Therefore, we're not able to see those life that are formed, or those selves that are formed through destructive processes, as selves. We just see them as, or existence as such, we just see them as obstacle for someone. And her example is her grandmother with Alzheimer. People with Alzheimer is just one of the examples of destructive work of plasticity, because destructive plasticity works through destruction. We would see those people as, we still think that there is the original self that is not touched by destruction, not touched by a certain state as Alzheimer. And whoever this person is now with Alzheimer, we don't recognize them as self. We just see them as the obstacle. They used their original self. But through her concept of destructive plasticity, Catherine Malabou was able to show that, to develop language that actually talks about this new self formed through destruction, the self for whom there is no salvation, to see the amount of tragedy that is in this self. Otherwise, this other positive accounts, they don't recognize the tragedy. It's just, we can possibly fix it, if not now, maybe in the future. And you don't see this new creation of destruction, and don't recognize the whole amount of tragedy in it. So for Sabina Spielrein and for Catherine Malabou, it's about destruction and creation. And it's again the similar logic that there is no life, there is just this destruction or death that is going on, and that we just call it life or form of life. It's actually destruction that is going on. For Catherine Malabou, it's sometimes problematic, because it's still, sometimes she talks about certain group of people as if they are those products of destructive plasticity, as if there is other project, and this group of people, particular people, are the deviation from how it's supposed to be. But sometimes she actually talks about destructive plasticity as universal, as this is what is universally going on. Maybe sometimes for some groups of people, it's just in more condensed form, in more intense forms, but universally, I would claim that destructive plasticity is the basic, the core plasticity. It's not going to end up well for all of us. It's never a path of salvation. It just, any cure is just the moment of rest in the general framework of destruction that is actually going on. For Sabina Spielrein, she would talk about creation as destruction. She would claim that it's just a matter of taste. You can see the same realities through the perspective that we prefer, perspective of creation, and for example love or reproduction. We love to see reproduction and love as a matter of creation, because we multiply through it and there's more people as a result of production. So it seems obvious to equalize reproduction with creation. But she claims that you can equally, if you want, you can see it from a negative perspective as a destruction that is going on. The love, reproduction as expansion of destructivity. We can use concept of entropy here. It's expansion of entropy through what we see as a reproduction is just one sequence, an artificial view of a larger process of destruction that is going on. And it's interesting to think about love as death, as expansion of death, or love as destructive power at its core. Because, for example, my favorite example is maternal love, which we also, it's easier to see as a creation, because you nurture a child, you're supposed to, you have to try to nurture a child, and you preserve life. So there is supposed to be more life and more positive things. But at the same time, it can be seen as the self-destruction, as a sacrifice of a mother. So you might have life that you cherish, but it's also life that is your death. And we can see any type of love, including romantic love, not from the positive perspective. But I think what is really going on is this destruction merging with the other, or sacrifice of your life, of certain features of your existence, certain aspects of existence to the other. So you die into the other. And it might be seen as a result, the person who you taking care of, who you love, might be seen as a positive result of your sacrifice, your destruction for them. But at the same time, they can be seen not as a positive, but as an extension of your destruction, because the child, seemingly positive entity, positive subject that you nurture and that's supposed to extend life, it can be just seen as, because it's also suffering subject, it's the result or embodiment of part of your sacrifice. You died into them, so it can be seen as expansion of your death. And if you see the future generation, it's even worse, because so this is just an example how love can be seen, something that by definition is seen for us as a positive thing. At the core, we can also switch perspective to more negative if we want, and see it as a actually expansion of destruction. And I also think that love, we tend to think that it's something that heals, and it might heal, but also this healing can be seen as within the larger, more tragic process of just suffering together, an expansion of suffering. And again, it's not to argue that we're not supposed to love each other. It's on the contrary, maybe to show what love actually takes, that is the participation in others' suffering without sliding, failing into the positive story. Because once you slide into the positive story and see something that can be finished, and something love as the project that has successful ending, that's not love. If you love someone, you stay in their suffering with other until they die, and dying is not, that's the end. And then after their death too, when they're inside of you, and when you love them even more and feel them even more present when they're not with you. So there's the tragic story that underlies love, and the tragic eternity of suffering, and the tragedy in love. It's not the project with successful ending. It's rather the story of a possible happy ending with love is, I don't know, like with motherhood. The idea is the successful mother love is that you nurture a child, and then child exists fully nurtured. It's not what's happening. They proceed to, like any human being, to their own suffering, their own extension of suffering. Maybe they have their own children as a punishment for what they did to us. But there is never end. There is a happy end to love. So love in this way is internal, but it's an eternity of tragedy rather. Being in love is being in touch with this universal human suffering. It's the opposite of the story of salvation. So this is love. It's not the type of love that is unhealthy because it's destructive. It's love itself that is unfortunately unhealthy. The story of a possible happy ending of love, when they have those movies that just end in a right moment when everyone is still alive, you just need to, that's happy ending. It's never a happy ending if you're involved enough. It ends either with your death or with the death of a loved one, and you never know which one is better. That's love. It never ends well. Story of a happy ending, it's rather the illusion for us may be necessary to endure the opposite, the impossibility of happy endings in love.
Trauma in your work isn't a deviation from normal life, but a structure of life itself. We are shaped by what breaks us. How does this shift the way we think about healing if there's no original wholeness to return to?
Yeah, I'm trying to see trauma as not a deviation as a core. Initially, when Freud was, and he's the one who is introducing after Charcot, well, he's known to introduce the concept of trauma in psychoanalysis and in psychology. When he talks about it, he kind of recognizes it, or at least he gives us foundation to recognize it as universal. But at the same time, he does still hope that trauma is the obstacle. Trauma is not structural, but it's something happens as an obstacle, something that not supposed to happen. And from this, we have idea of possible cure, of restoring coherence of the self. For him, for Freud, trauma is a foreign body, a foreign experience, something that ruptures us from inside, something we cannot make a certain experience, that we cannot make a coherent part of our psyche, that precludes the functioning of psyche, the foreign element. But psychoanalysis was, as an example, Lacanian psychoanalysis, it's more inclined to recognize trauma as structural. Trauma for Lacan is at the core of a subject, so any subject is not coherent in its at its core. Any subject is already traumatic subject, and it has to do uh, with the idea of lack at the core, a certain split. So there is no coherency at the core. There is the structural incoherency to who we are. So from this perspective, this gives trauma a universal even status, because it's not seen normally in psychology. When we talk about trauma, psychological trauma, we talk about it in a positive way in terms of obstacle to overcome, something to heal. And this is what therapy would work on, like post-traumatic stress disorder, how to fix it, how to deal with it. And this is more as a part of the more general project of this positive salvational orientation, which presupposes that therapeutic perspective, positive perspective, presupposes that somewhere inside of us we are not split, we are not ruptured, we are not suffering, we are all happy, coherent, and not suffering. So this idea of subject that we need to restore through overcoming. From negative perspective, trauma is very, very important. It's at the core of you. It's not, you cannot overcome it. You can maybe mask it. You can maybe cover it with a fantasy, or you can find a way to deal with it. But whenever something happens, you fall into the reality of trauma. You fall into the what is structural to you. You can never get rid of it. You can only mask it or deal with it. It's structural, and any particular trauma would be just a reminder of this structural, more existential trauma at the core of your existence. And the other thing is that maybe bringing into consideration the perspective of depressive realism. From perspective of depressive realism, if you're depressed or there's some kind of eternal suffering in you, it might make you see reality more clearly. It's also a question, what does it mean clearly from here? It's not the clearly that reality for how it is. But if you take trauma as one of those negative states, from normally in our therapeutic society, we see people who are traumatized with post-traumatic stress disorder as inadequately comprehending reality. Like, this is the distorted perception of reality, which presupposes that reality is better. But from this perspective, you can even talk from depressive realism perspective, or negative perspective, you can even talk of initiation of trauma. Trauma initiates you on how, like, takes away all the illusions. For example, that our loved ones will live forever, or we will not suffer, or any kind of salvation is possible. It just takes away this illusion from you, and you see reality from what it is. It's not that you know now, and it's not theoretical knowledge. It's not the knowledge, it's rather non-knowledge, the impossibility of any knowledge, the impossibility of making sense. It's rather just witnessing a horror of existence without being able to even talk about it that much. This impossibility of knowledge, impossibility of talking, that's perspective, not the reality in a clear theoretical thing. This may be too, but the other type of reality. The reality, you just stare in horror instead of being able to talk about it. Because being able to talk about it, this is what talking therapy is aimed to, when you need to talk. So talking might be seen as imposing illusions. So from this perspective, any instance of trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder can be seen as the aftermath of initiation into how reality is. And I would still argue that one need different methods to, even if it's a lie that we keep telling ourselves, but it's the necessary lie. Whoever is able to not to be dedicated, or not to see world from a negative perspective, I would really recommend not to see it from the negative perspective. But once you know it, just, you cannot go back to the perspective where you are told otherwise. You just won't trust these people, and you won't be, once you know, you just, there is nothing you can you can do about the flashbacks and the
Where you write exposes the same logic on a collective scale, the drive to create through ruin. How do you see this relation between psychic destruction and political violence, for example?
I see. So when I started to talk about criticism, criticizing toxic positivity of therapeutic society, and in general, positive orientation of therapeutic society. It was before wars, before genocide, and for now, it feels like I told you, we're not positive anymore. We're forced to witness suffering. We are forced to be negative. It's very inadequate right now to be, and on one hand, I can say I told you so, but it just as a so what is my, but still, I'm thinking that sometimes this death drive, psychoanalytic concept, is equalized with wars and aggressiveness, and I don't think it's so. I think a war and being aggressive, like all the acting out or destroying everything that is aimed at this, that is acting out destruction, I think it's quite positive. It's an attempt to limit the negativity. And in relation to war, I would rather bring into consideration Bataille comprehension of generalized war, because Bataille, who also witnessed the war and for whom war was something that witnessing war made him bring this concept into philosophy, and he would say the other way around, how we normally comprehend it, that we need to reduce war, is the opposite for him. For him, Bataille is the philosopher who recognizes the universal destruction of the universe that is going on, a structural destruction at the heart of the universe. And for him, it's not that you have to limit the war, because the war is already a limitation of this destruction. You kill the other, destroy the other in order to take it under control or to reduce this universal destruction. And from this perspective, it's rather the opposite from the negative perspective. It's universalizing, not trying to reduce it to kind of certain strange way of solving the problem by killing a certain group of people. You overpower the destruction. You need to, sounds horrible, but emancipate rather this eternal destruction. And it's happening through love. It's in love that you do it. Love that has much more destruction. There is space for destruction and suffering and universal tragedy. And war would be rather a way of dealing with it, reducing it. Like we will destroy a certain group of people and then it's going to be great. That's salvation. It's still the positive project of salvation. And we see how to do it through controlling, limiting, and any war is happening is motivated by ending the war. It's promising you salvation. Now we just destroy this group of people, like Ukrainians, for example, and everything is going to be much better. So this war is, in this sense, is too positive. It offers salvation through directing destruction. So rather, for me, the negative answer would be more destruction. It's destruction that is love, when we're all equally destructed. We all love each other, and through this, it destroys us, something like it.
Yeah, that's really well explained. I want to transition into the human animal. How does the human animal, an organism cursed by consciousness of its own decay, serve as the implicit subject of negative practice? A being whose analysis begins not from lack, but from the structural impossibility of repair.
That's a great question, but I will answer. I will redirect it to the little bit different direction. So for me, the problem with the account of philosophical pessimism and with account of depressive realism is their overemphasis on consciousness. It seems like they represent as the only negative perspective that is available there in philosophy and psychology, that would say that everything is horrible and that we are not going to be saved and human is. It's better if we would never existed. But my problem with this, the only negative perspective that exists, is that they overemphasize consciousness for them, and they make human beings special. For them, human beings cursed with consciousness, as the consciousness is the core of the human suffering. I don't agree with it. I don't think the consciousness is such the main issue. And I don't think that we are superior in this kind of our extended suffering to other animals. So we cannot say that we suffer more than other animals, and it's because of suffering, because of the overly extended consciousness. I think it's too kind of kind to people, it's still seeing them as superior, even if they're claiming that they're not human, not supposed to exist because they have overly developed consciousness that makes them suffer. But I would still claim that for me, suffering is universal feature. It's just how universe exists and manifests itself in various forms in various species. We just represent the various mutations of suffering in various creative ways. So I would rather locate the core of suffering. And I think this, whoever talks about consciousness as an instance of the most intense suffering, they never felt in love, because this is where actual horror going on when witnessing the other who you love suffer is much worse than your own sufferings. This, I think, love in betweenness of people, or in betweenness within nature, what is happening with animals is something like it. So it's not our own consciousness that because we're so smart and we ask so questions that are impossible to answer, or we want to know the meaning of existence, and we cannot learn, we can never find out what's the meaning of existence because it's meaningless. That's not suffering. It's not even close. Witnessing how the one who you love suffer or dies, that's the suffering. That's something that you can never even talk about that much or theorize into theory when you're just speechless. That's suffering. So the suffering, as it's seen as central and defining to human existence because of our overly developed consciousness in depressive realism and in pessimist philosophy, that's not suffering at all. Maybe real suffering cannot be talked about and cannot be philosophized. It's just something you live through and something that leaves you speechless.
How does positive psychology sort of transform happiness into a moral sort of obligation? And I think in the book you argue that it sort of is converting emotion into sort of a technology of governance. Is that right?
My main enemy is still positive psychology and CBT. I just don't like them. And I feel that they're imposing certain perspectives, and they don't like me, of course. But I would still hesitate to criticize it. I think that it's strangely also very negative in a way, because well, you see it from a perspective, that you represent a certain theory and certain perspective on the world and certain way of how one's supposed to exist. But you can also see whatever one is saying as who is it, who one is saying it to. And the positive philosophy, positive psychology and CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, they can be seen as a way of us taking care of each other, like therapists of their patients. And in general, in relationship, we now tend to rely on various positive psychology techniques. It can be seen as our way of taking care of each other. But I also see it as negative in terms of this kind of lie, the positive lie that they represent. It's also a way of dealing with suffering, because who do we say these things to? Like, everything is going to be fine, or you are great, everyone loves you, or I love you, something like it. So this saying positive things, this kind of lie, is also a way of dealing with suffering. We at the same time saying the opposite, because who are we saying it to? It's precisely a way of, to a depressed person, it's a way of existing, supporting them in their depression. So it's kind of this negative underside to it too. It's the way of recognizing suffering. For me, the positively oriented person, the person who screams that everything is going to be fine, for me, it's a very desperate person. It's their way of and imposing this perspective of others. So their way of either dealing with suffering that they recognize, trying to escape from it, but still dealing with it in their escape, or taking care of the other. That's what we would say to our children, that everything is going to be fine, because we know it won't. That's the horrible. That's why we're saying it. So kind of the positive psychology is also negative in this way. They just don't recognize it. They just one of the ways of at the same time not recognizing it, but also recognizing it, because we say the most positive things we say when the most horrible things are happening. For instance, when everyone starts to believe in God suddenly, that's something like it. So it's quite negative in this way. Maybe sometimes in certain instances more negative than negative project that I'm leading.
Yeah. Uh, so when you think about the contemporary vocabulary of resilience and mindfulness, How do you see that?
Well, it personally irritates me, but I also see it as a necessary tragic act of care. That's how I tolerate it. But at the same time, I know that there is a demand for certain people not to articulate it, and certain people who wouldn't accept it, who would see it as a lie and as something that is not genuine, and they just they would require a different type of care, like teenagers, for example, who are very resistant to positive psychology, who just doesn't work on them, and it's more like conversion into something like it used to be with religion. Now it was this perspective. So those people would require less lies, or maybe different form of lies. It just for people, what I'm doing, maybe for people who are irritated by this form of lies.
Yeah. So on your website, you have a page with a list of certified negative practitioners, and you're part of a discipline now that is grounded in negative practice. Can you give some insight into how that has come together and what sort of work is happening on that front?
Yeah, I'm trying. What I'm trying to practice is negative practice, and I also have people who who are certified by me to be negative practitioners. But the thing is that ultimately, this project's supposed to be a failed project because the negative practice is as such impossible, because all the projects are salvational projects by definition. They aim to improve or aim to offer something better. So maybe the only way for it exists is in the form of failure. Or also it's interesting with the certificates, they're also I state on those certificates that they're completely useless. So the idea is to resist to a certain extent, but of course it's impossible to completely resist it. It still ends up or gets corrupted with positivity, ending up presenting itself as another better practice, which it's not supposed to be. So but for now it exists in the form of failure, and we also not supposed to know what the negative practice is, which is another subversive moment. Like you cannot teach it because you're not supposed to know what is it, but at least it's interesting. It's like something for those to do who doesn't know and doesn't want to do anything else in particular.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting how the discipline was grounded in sort of a non-method, right? Or institutionalization. And then on one level, and you were explaining that, which I thought was really cool. Final question, I guess. On the page itself, it talks about it does not aim to improve your life. It does not hold space for your growth. It is not guided by hope that despair is ultimately something to overcome. Negative practice is not an alternative therapeutic practice. So as you were saying before, any last words when it comes to negative practice and what you're trying to build?
Yeah, those words on my website are just there to scare away people who are wrong, who still have a hope and still have their own practices to do the one that would aim for improvement, but at the same time to attract people who like-minded, who already know the same thing, to explore the space of negativity, this kind of glitching space of not able to exist in the positive dimension, but at the same time not fully, completely falling into yet on a way to, because this it just ends up in a complete death.
Yeah.
So this kind of interesting negative space that existing and guarding and not inviting people, but rather signaling that it exists for someone who wants to join.
Any final words in terms of, work that you're doing, research interests, uh, questions that you're looking to address in the future?
We currently have a book on death and love being published, with various scholars approaching the link between death and love, and we will have event in November where each will present their chapter. Um, yeah, I'm actually trying to stay away from academia and academic, all the formal spaces, and hopefully I will completely disappear from it one day. So it might be a last chance to engage.
Yeah. No, I can relate to that. And again, thank you for appearing on the Organic Filaments Network and for this conversation and for a body of work that refuses to turn despair into spectacle or solution. Negative Psychoanalysis for the Living Dead asks what it means to live without promise, but still with the precision, tenderness, and thought. That was our conversation with Julie Reshe. If you found this meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the work, visit buymeacoffee.com/organic filaments network. Thank you.
Thank you, Sher.